Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a whole stack of sources.
Right, we've got analyses from KI Insights, Oxford Academic, the Lowy Institute, even a media report from Brand Ukraine.
And they're all grappling with, well, probably the critical question right now, the future of the war in Ukraine. Especially, looking at it through the lens of a potential leadership change in the U.S.
Exactly. And these sources, they offer us a kind of shortcut, really, cutting through the noise to give you the essential insights.
Our mission, then, is to pull out those key nuggets, help you make sense of the complex possibilities, the challenges.
And maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way, just enough context to connect the dots for you.
Absolutely. So first stop, the battlefield. What was the reality on the ground, according to these sources, say, late 2024, early 2025? What picture do they paint?
Well, it's a tough one for Kiev, according to these analyses. Since summer 2024, the situation had reportedly, deteriorated.
Deteriorated how?
Russia was slowly gaining the upper hand. It was becoming essentially a war of attrition.
A war of attrition, just grinding down the other side.
That's it. And the sources say Russia was getting better at piercing weak spots in Ukraine's defenses, gaining territory faster than they had since, early 2022.
And was there a core reason cited for Ukraine's difficulties?
Yeah, a consistent weakness mentioned is a shortage of combat-effective manpower, a really significant shortage.
And that's not something quickly fixed, I imagine?
No, not according to these sources. Even with Western aid flowing, it's a deep structural challenge.
Although I did notice a point in one source, I think it was Lowy Institute, it mentioned that as of August 2024, yes, Russian offenses were continuing, but maybe losing a bit of steam.
Right, losing some momentum. And crucially, Ukraine had pulled off that shock operation inside Russia's Kursk Oblast.
So not entirely a one-way street of Russian advances then.
No, not entirely. The Kursk operation showed Ukraine could still, surprise people, create potential bargaining chips, even though Russia did eventually regain ground there.
Okay.
So the ground truth is complex. It's a difficult picture for Ukraine overall, major challenges like manpower, absolutely, but still capable of inflicting costs, still trying to shift the dynamic.
Right. So with that difficult reality as the backdrop, let's pivot to what these sources see as maybe the major factor shaping the future.
Yeah.
The potential return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency.
Yeah, and one analysis, the Oxford Academic one, really digs into his first term's foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine.
And it uses pretty strong language, doesn't it? Calling it profoundly incoherent.
It does. The paper argues it wasn't just sort of flawed policy in the normal sense, but a failure of coherence, a failure of clear articulation and transparency, too.
And the examples they give really seem to highlight that contradiction. You had the official State Department line.
Right. Crimea's Ukraine, sanctions stay until Russia pulls back, support for military aid. That was the official policy.
But then, as the source details, Trump himself publicly questioned Crimea's status. There were reports he resisted selling things like Javelin missiles.
And the big one, suspending that congressionally approved aid to Ukraine.
Right, the whole saga with the linkage, first unofficially to investigations into the Bidens, then later framed as general corruption concerns. That's presented as part of this pattern.
Exactly. And his push to get Russia back into the G7, make it the G8 again. The source really suggests these mixed signals, sometimes outright contradictory messages from the president, were characteristic.
And the lack of transparency the Oxford analysis points to is, pretty striking too, fewer press briefings.
Minimal official records of meetings with Russian officials, sometimes apparently with no other U.S. officials even in the room. Reports of notes being confiscated.
Or even potentially destroyed.
Yeah. And this combination, the incoherence and the lack of transparency, the source argues, it just made it incredibly hard to figure out what was going on using normal foreign policy analysis.
It's like the link was broken between what the president seemed to want and what the administration was actually saying its policy was.
Precisely. The president's views often seemed disconnected from the stated foreign policy.
And here's a really provocative point from that analysis. It suggests that this confusion, this incoherence coming from the U.S. president, maybe the Russian government took it seriously.
Yeah, that it might have actually contributed to their calculation, potentially lowering their perceived risk in, extending their aggression. That's a pretty heavy potential consequence they draw out.
So thinking about that past incoherence, it makes you wonder about a potential second term. What do the sources see as the possibilities now? Trump's big claim, ending the war in 24 hours.
That's central, isn't it? Reports that his team is aiming for a quick peace deal.
And the sources seem clear on where his leverage lies, mainly with Ukraine, right? The threat of cutting off military aid, financial aid, that's direct pressure on Kiev.
Oh, absolutely. But what's much, much less clear, as the sources point out, is his leverage over Putin.
Especially when, as we just discussed, Russia feels it has some battlefield momentum.
Exactly. KI Insights puts it bluntly. How do you freeze a front line that's like a rolling boil right now? And Putin's big goals, his maximalist demands, they don't seem to have changed at all.
That really gets to the heart of the challenge for any quick deal. But there's that interesting twist from the Lowy Institute analysis.
Yes, the counterintuitive idea.
Yeah, it suggests that if Trump can't get that quick win, if the 24 hours thing doesn't pan out, his potential fear of looking weak
could actually make him turn on Putin. Maybe even increase support for Ukraine.
It's a fascinating possibility, right?
Yeah.
Suggests his personal motivation avoiding failure might actually override previous policy leanings if that primary goal of a quick, successful deal isn't met.
It definitely adds a huge layer of unpredictability to whatever might happen.
So, okay, we have this tough ground situation. We have this uncertain Trump factor.
Yeah.
What are the paths forward? How might this actually end or evolve? The sources map out a few scenarios.
KI Insights is quite specific here. First possibility, a concession-free peace.
What does that look like?
Basically, a ceasefire, lines frozen where they are, and this is key, with hard, real security guarantees for Ukraine.
And the chances of that happening?
They rate it as very difficult, almost impossible.
Wow. Why so low?
Because, as they put it, it needs a best-case manifestation of all outside actors. Everything has to go right. Meaning, Trump would need to be ready to use serious leverage on Russia. Putin would need to be feeling, quote, weak, nervous, and willing to just give up his current momentum. And Europe would need to step up massively, take direct responsibility for Ukraine's security.
And the current signals aren't pointing that way.
The sources suggest they're mostly leaning in the opposite direction, unfortunately.
Okay, so if that ideal path is almost impossible, what's scenario number 2?
A desperate compromise peace. They also call it a soft capitulation for Ukraine.
That sounds bleak. What does it involve?
A ceasefire, yes, but based on Ukraine making significant concessions, giving things up.
And how might that come about?
Well, the sources suggest maybe Trump can't pressure Putin effectively, or he gets frustrated and just disengages, or maybe cut some separate deal with Russia that leaves Ukraine exposed.
Or the battlefield situation itself just gets so bad.
Exactly, so bad that Ukraine feels forced to accept terms they would have previously found completely unacceptable.
Gosh, that's a truly awful potential choice for Kyiv.
It is. And then there's the third scenario, which is pretty stark. Russia doesn't stop.
Meaning?
Meaning, if the other paths don't work out, if U.S. and European aid isn't enough, and Ukraine's manpower crisis continues, Russia just keeps pushing towards its maximalist goals.
Which could mean
Yeah.
annexing more territory, setting up a puppet government.
Or leaving just a fragment, a rump state of Ukraine. As one source asks, why would Russia stop if they feel they have the advantage and the conditions aren't met to force them to? Putin's stance, as we've noted, seems fixed on those big war aims, not de-escalation.
These scenarios really lay bare the stakes, and it highlights how much depends on the interplay between the main players, their goals, their leverage, their weaknesses.
Absolutely. Let's briefly touch on those, based on the sources. You've got Donald Trump. Objective seems to be that quick peace deal.
Leverage clearly over Zelenskyy via aid.
Yeah.
Over Putin. Less clear, especially quick battlefield options seem limited.
Right. Weaknesses include not being a direct party, domestic distractions, maybe pulling focus, and his stance could swing wildly, pushing Putin hard, freezing the lines quickly, settling for peace at almost any cost, or just getting frustrated and walking away.
Then Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Yeah.
Objective, a secure post-war Ukraine. Real guarantees.
His leverage. Well, it's Ukraine's own defense efforts, making the war costly for Russia, plus lobbying allies for aid.
Weaknesses are stark, though. The deteriorating military situation, that manpower crisis we talked about.
Yeah, so his stance is likely trying to hold out for the best possible terms, bolster Ukraine's negotiating position through defense, but potentially facing that terrible choice of a compromised peace if things get desperate enough.
And Vladimir Putin. Objectives seem unambiguous in these sources. Military victory, essentially destroying sovereign Ukraine, continuing hybrid warfare against the West.
Leverage comes from battlefield gains, controlling occupied land, the potential threat of future reinvasion. His stance seems uninterested in de-escalation, focused on those maximalist aims.
Finally, Europe. Objectives. recognizing Ukraine matters for their own security, projecting some strength.
Potential leverage in maybe building a future security structure, co-financing Ukraine's military needs. But the big weakness highlighted is internal division.
Right, stopping them from taking decisive action, often being too slow, too late with support.
So Europe's stance could range from really pushing for that best-case scenario alongside the U.S. to getting...
It's just so clear they're all coming at this from vastly different positions with different tools and constraints.
And adding another layer is how this is all perceived. That Brand Ukraine media analysis is fascinating. It looks at international media coverage and U.S. public opinion.
And the way the U.S. is portrayed is really striking, isn't it? A real mix.
Totally. You see positive descriptions, world leader, important partner, critical supplier.
But then also really negative ones. Super unreliable, increasingly fickle, unpredictable, even things like backstabbing or abandoning Ukraine, losing credibility. It's quite the range.
It is. And Ukraine itself gets mixed framing, too. Positives like fought bravely, courageous, defenders of freedom.
But also criticisms. Not showing commitment, hostile in negotiations, needing to meaningfully engage.
Yeah. And the U.S. public opinion data they cite is also quite revealing. One survey showed Trump rated more effective than Zelenskyy overall.
And significantly more so among Republicans, right?
Right. And Republican sympathy for Ukraine took a noticeable dip over a few months from 58% down to 45% in the data shown.
Though, it's important, as you said, sympathy for Russia didn't really go up. It was more a shift away from strong sympathy for Ukraine.
Correct. And interestingly, support for military aid doesn't perfectly mirror friendly views of Ukraine. The data also showed declining views of traditional allies like the UK, Germany, France.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground. What does this all mean when you put the pieces together? What's the bottom line from these sources?
Well, I think the picture they paint is this. Yes, the idea of a U.S. brokered peace, especially under a potential Trump administration, it's definitely on the table. It's a real possibility.
Right.
But the path to get there is anything but straightforward. It's incredibly complex, incredibly uncertain.
The past pattern, that incoherence from Trump's first term regarding Russia and Ukraine, casts a long shadow.
Absolutely. And you combine that with the really difficult current military situation, Russia gaining ground, Ukraine's manpower issues, it creates huge obstacles for any quick or easy fix, especially one that would be favorable to Kyiv.
And the clashing goals and leverage of all the key players, Trump, Zelenskyy, Putin, Europe, it makes any negotiation just incredibly fraught with difficulty.
It really seems to leave Ukraine potentially facing that awful choice we discussed.
Between a soft capitulation piece, making major concessions,
or continuing the fight under deeply uncertain conditions, even while they still aim for that ideal of a concession-free peace with strong guarantees. The most realistic outcomes presented by these sources seem to fall somewhere in that difficult space.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of shifting public and media perceptions, particularly in the U.S., which just adds another layer of uncertainty about future American support, which is so critical.
So we've taken this deep dive, pulled apart these sources, looked at the complexities, the echoes from the past, the harsh realities of the present battlefield, and the, frankly, quite stark possibilities for the future.
We've seen how leader motivations, their leverage, the dynamics of international support, public opinion, how all these things could twist and turn to shape what happens next.
It really leaves us, and you, with a crucial question to mull over, something these sources grapple with from different angles.
In a world where, let's face it, foreign policy from big powers can seem unpredictable, almost erratic sometimes, and the military facts on the ground are brutally clear, how much does individual leadership actually steer the ship towards peace?
Or is it ultimately constrained, maybe even determined, by those forces on the ground, by the collective will or the lack of will of everyone involved?
Something significant to think about as you digest all these insights.